Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our new series, which is on Shmuel, the book of Samuel. And this is our introduction class. I'm going to touch on certain things that we see in this book, what its place is in Tanakh, right? What it does differently, maybe from other books, and we'll go from there. So, what is the book of Shmuel? So, first of all, just so we know, we have, First Samuel and Second Samuel. How far back do we split this book? This book was originally, of course, one book. Now that this book draws on different sources. I'm not saying that the whole book is kind of written just in one piece at one time. It draws from different sources. It takes different narratives and tries to reconcile them. It has, for example, two different stories of how David meets Shaul. How does David meet Saul? Two different stories in the book that are patched together not completely smoothly, right? Clearly coming from two different traditions of how David met Shaul, right? But the book as a book, it starts with essentially the origin of Shmuel, of Samuel, and then it continues on, continues on through the kingship of Shaul, and then goes on through David, right? It essentially ends the first book, First Samuel, Shmuel Aleph, ends essentially with the death of Shaul, with the death of Saul, and the real beginning of the kingship of David, right? And then Second Samuel, Shmuel Bet, continues on, and it kind of ends almost with an appendix saying, oh, and here's some other cool stories that happened in the time of David, right? But it kind of covers the kingship of David, and including the things that happened with his children. And then when we get into First Kings, into Malachim Aleph, that picks up with the very end of David's reign, because it's the setup for Shlomo's reign, for the reign of Solomon. In other words, when we get into First Kings, we're reading about the death of David and the aged David, right? And his death, because that's what we need to learn about to understand Shlomo and his kingship, right? And his rule. Whereas the book of Samuel actually centers around David and his reign, right? You could say it's interesting because there's a rebellion, of course, in the book of Shmuel, the rebellion of Avshalom against his father. Avshalom rebels against his father when his father is in the middle of his reign. Like, there's no reason why anyone should be taking over from David. When we're in First Kings and Adoniyahu says, I should rule, he's actually not in the charge of a rebellion. He simply wants to say, hey, David's going to die. He's already really old. He can't really rule anymore. I'm the crown prince. I'm the heir apparent. So it's not treated the same way as the rebellion of Absalom is. So the book of Shmuel really is mostly the story of David. Like, most of it is really talking about David, his experiences when not yet a king, and his rise, and then his kingship and its fall. It starts with Shmuel, who is also an important character. And it starts with, what's interesting is that its place is in between Shoftim, Judges, right? And the book of Kings. It's interesting, in the Septuagint, the books are First Kings, or First Kingdom, Second Kingdoms, Third Kingdoms, Fourth Kingdoms. In other words, Shmuel Aleph, First Samuel is First Kings, essentially, First Kingdoms, right? Shmuel Ben second, and then Kings is third and fourth, right, in the Septuagint. That's the first place where this book is split. It's first split when we get to what we call the Alexandrian Jewish Bible, okay? When we get into the Alexandrian Jewish Bible, well into the Second Temple period, that's the first time the book is split. However, in the Masoretic text, in the text that the Jews of Judea keep, it is not split. It is not split until the early 16th century with the Bomberg Bible, with the Bomberg Tanakh, which is printed in Venice. Bomberg split, Daniel Bomberg that print actually splits it. That's when we first have in our Hebrew Bible a split of Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. And he's simply mirroring the Christian split, which is mirroring the Septuagint split, which was a Jewish split, right? So it's not, oh, it was only ever a Christian split. There was a Jewish split among the Alexandrian Jews because it was such a long book. And then the Christians simply adopted, of course, that split. And then when Bomberg printed the Tanakh in the early 16th century, then he had that split. Before then, we didn't split it. The Hebrew Bible didn't split Shmuel at all. It was just one long book. Now, as I said, there is actually a difference. There is a reason to split Shmuel, Aleph, and Shmuel Bet where it's split. There is a difference because it's kind of the kingship of the real rule of David really is the second Samuel, right? But it's one continuous story. As opposed to, let's say, for example, First Kings, Second Kings, it's kind of an arbitrary split. It's just split in the middle. Okay, so in terms of, I know someone's going to ask me about dates. That's why I made sure to write myself some dates. Okay, so if we're talking about Shaul, so he would reign, let's say, from 1030 to 1010 BCE. David would be then 1010 to 970 BCE, and his son Shlomo Solomon would be 970 to 930 BCE. Now, what are some, so here we have a book. It's taking us, it's placed between Shoftim, Judges, and Melachim, Kings. And in fact, it is setting up the way kingship is going to work in Israel, which is different from the way kingship works in the ancient Near East. Because in the Israelite tradition that is being set up, a prophet can go to the king and say, you are messing up. You did something that is beyond your rights as a king. Your rights are restricted. You can't just do whatever you want. And I, the prophet, as a representative of God, am here to tell you, you just messed up, buddy. Now, those prophets can either be more accepted by the king or less accepted by the king. But there's a kind of a rule that the king just can't kill the prophet, right? That's not what the king should be doing. That's not what the king is allowed to do, because the king has a limited monarchy in a way that in other ancient Near Eastern traditions, he does not. I'm not saying that there weren't prophets all over the ancient Near East and in all these different kingdoms. They also had prophets. But if a prophet was going to go to a king and say, you are screwing up, as opposed to say, like, a prophet could come to a king and say, hey, I know why there's a famine in the land. It's because your father sinned. Like that would be a thing that like a prophet, let's say, could do, because the king wants to know, why is there a famine? What do I need to do to fix it? Right? But he would not say, hey, you weren't allowed to sleep with that woman, right? That's not what a prophet would be able to do if he wanted to keep his prophetic head, right? But in the kingdom, in the Judahite, Israelite kingdom, that is in fact the function of a prophet. It can be the function of prophet. Of course, their court prophets were simple yes men. But what we have set up very much from the story of Shmuel and Shaul, where Shaul tries, there's actually, and we're going to look at it, there's a place where Shaul actually brings sacrifices without Shmuel there, and he gets in big trouble. Because Shmuel sees it, and it's an attempt by Shaul to kind of say, no, I'll do everything. Like, nobody, you're the secular king, I'm the prophet. And Shmuel is an interesting prophet because he totally serves, because he also serves in the tabernacle. He serves as a priestly figure, even though he's not a priest, right? And he's like, no, I bring the sacrifices. You're a king. That's different, right? And I can tell you when you messed up. And in fact, we have in this book, what we'll see is a series of messing up, right? People mess up. How do they mess up? Let's take a look and see some examples. Let me open up our first mess up.
Miriam?
Yes. Can you hear him? Can you hear me?
When you talk about the reign of David, you mean beginning in Hebron?
Depending on what did I say specifically about the reign of David?
From, I believe, 1010 until 970? But you mean David from the time he's ruling in Hebron, not necessarily in Ir David.
I'm not saying when does he conquer Jerusalem. That's not what I'm talking about. That's what you're asking, right?
Yes.
No, I'm talking about his rule period. I'm not talking about when he conquers Jerusalem.
Miriam?
Yes.
When you are talking about like, the difference, how special it is, like in our Bible, that the prophet, can overthrow the king, that's the way it's presented. But when we look at it historically, like even though we presented as if Shmuel overthrew Saul, historically he just stopped reigning when he died in battle. So from someone from the outside who would look, you would say, oh, this has no connection to the prophet.
Yes, you're right. And he never says, he says to Shaul, what Shaul loses, and this is an important point, what Shaul loses is never the kingship. What he actually loses is Beit HaMlucha. Beit HaMlucha, the house of kingship. What is the house of kingship? He cannot bequeath his rule to his son, right? Which is one of the reasons he gets really angry at Yonatan who becomes really friendly with David. He's like, I'm doing everything for you, Yonatan. I want you to rule, and you're screwing it up by palling around with this guy who's going to be king instead of you, right? Now, of course, Shaul kind of loses it, right? But what he loses, you're right, is never his kingship. He dies a king. Shaul dies a king, but Yonatan is never a king, and he will never be a king.
But Ishbosheth is the king. So like historically, Ishbosheth took over, and then, Avner,
The point is that Ishbosheth is never really going to be. In other words, Ishbosheth has a rule so insignificant, we don't even really talk about him. He's not, that's the whole point. The whole point is not that no one's going to try to, not that no one's going to try to inherit your throne. The idea is that it's not going to work. It's not going to work, and it doesn't work. And the fact is, you are right that this is the story being told. This is the setup that we're being told. We're being told a king of Israel can't do whatever he wants. That's what we're being told. What would someone who's living this history think, right? They would obviously not think that, because kings pretty much do whatever they want. However, they don't kill the prophets who come to them and say, you're not allowed to do whatever you want. In other words, there's still an idea that a prophet is allowed to come to a king and say, you are wrong and you're going to be punished, right? And they can do that. And that's part of being a king of Israel, is that you got to listen to these guys. And that's a story that continues through Melachim, through the book of Kings. This idea that a prophet can come to the king, whether in the kingdom of Judah or the kingdom of Israel, and say, you are doing the wrong thing and you are going to be punished. And I'm saying your kingdom's going to end. This other guy's going to be king. I'm anointing a different king, that a prophet can anoint a different king, right? This idea, and that the reason is because that king has messed up and done something that he's not allowed to do. Now, frequently, what is the king not allowed to do? What the king's not allowed to do is something to do with corruption and using his position in a way that he's not allowed to use it. Now, this kind of jumps out at us. Let's take the first example of this, not from a king, but from Eli. Let me find the passage. So when Shmuel is already a young man and serving under Eli, Eli has sons, but Eli is essentially Eli seems to be pretty much in charge. He is at very least the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. He has sons who naturally should inherit from him, and yet they are not. They're not behaving the way they should behave. And the result is that they're going to have their rule, quote unquote, taken from them. So this is the first case where we have something like this, where because of corruption, in terms of using one's position, you lose the ability to pass on that position, or you lose the ability to have that position. And that's something that's an idea that's baked in, as it were. It's baked into this book. All right. So here we have, I'm reading from Shmuel Aleph, 1 Kings, Perek Bet, chapter 2. And this is where Shmuel has already been born. He's already been dedicated to service in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan. And the sons of Eli are priests under Eli. It says, Uvnei Eli, bnei Belial, lo yatu et Hashem. They are scoundrels. This is translating them as scoundrels. Bnei Belial are essentially people who do not behave in a way that is normative. They do not keep the standard rules of morality. That seems to be what a Ben Belial means. So ומשפט הכהנים את העם, כל איש זובח זבח ובא נער הכהן כבשל בשר ומזליק שלוש שיניים בידו. So whenever someone brings a sacrifice, the priest's helper comes along with the fork, and what he would do is essentially grab meat in a very kind of gross way to take for the priest. Whatever whatever the sacrifice is, he's just kind of grabbing in a greedy way meat for the priest, right? Even before they have burnt the fat, which they must burn because they're not allowed to eat it, that's the sacrifice. So even before they've actually burnt the whole sacrifice that you must give to God before eating the meat, they're grabbing the meat for the priest. In other words, they're being completely inappropriate. They're not keeping any of the rules of sacrifice. Their big thing is to grab over the meat. And they say, ואמר לאיש הזובח, תנה בשר לצלוק לכהן, ולא ניקח ממך בשר מבושל כי אם חי. He's like, hand over the meat. He wants it raw. He's not going to wait for you to boil it. In other words, they're being greedy and disgusting. They're not keeping the rules of sacrifice, and they're also being horrible. Now, part of this is, what does it look like to people who are coming to sacrifice? And this is the way the priest helper is acting. What are they thinking of the priesthood and the temple, the tabernacle, right? What is this creating? And it says, but it's all, and it's not only that, but they say, wait for us to burn up the fat and then take it. If you know, give it now or I'm going to grab it from you. So there's no norms. All they want is the meat, and this is disgusting. Okay? So this is a tremendous sin they've done against God. All right? The sin of the government was against God was very great, right? Because they have, it's not kinyatsu Hanashim, they have kind of contemptuously almost offended the sacrifice to God, right? So I'm going to skip over the part about Shmuel. It's important in the story of Shmuel. We're going to talk about it later when we talk about Shmuel. Now, Eli hears about this, but he's very old, so he doesn't take the strong stance that he must. He rebukes them, but it doesn't really, he kind of does it very gently. He says, Al banai, ki letova shmua asher anochi shomeh ma'avirim am Hashem. Right? He says, don't do this. It's not good. These rumors that I'm hearing that, that the nation of God is spreading. Now, he's kind of hinting here, this is the nation of God, and look how you're treating them. But it's not, it doesn't work. And he says, Im yachta ish leish ufilelo elokim v'im lo Hashem yachta ish mi yitpalel lo. He says, if you sin against people, you can pray to God to forgive you, but you're sinning against God. Who's going to forgive you now, right? But they didn't listen. What's actually funny is, let me go back, and I skipped this. There's another thing they're doing, which wasn't in our whole story where we were hearing about a whole dialogue. What's the other thing they're doing? They're also sleeping with the women who come to the entrance of the temple. That seems kind of worse. It seems kind of more egregious, right? So why are we just hearing this kind of like kind of by the way? Possibly because we don't want to go into depth. Like we can go into like detail with how they're taking the meat. We're not going to go into detail with what they're doing with the women, right? And also, it's not just them at fault, right? And if they're sleeping with the women are also at fault. One assumes, right? There's a possibility. It sounds though like they're somehow taking advantage of their position to sleep with these women, right? Again, taking advantage of their position.
Do not blame the victim, Miriam. Do not blame the victim.
That's a good point. We don't know, but it does say the language they're using is not language of rape. It is language that they're sleeping with them, but it does seem to be their fault. It is actually saying that it's on them, right? That they're doing it, as opposed to saying, well, and the women are doing whatever, right? So the punishment then comes from God. God says, I'm not going to allow you to kind of pass on the priesthood. I'm skipping to, we're in Pasuk Lamed, verse 30. Okay, remember chapter 2. L'chein na'om Hashem, he gets a prophecy, or I'm going back a little bit, right? Saying, why are you honoring your sons more than me, allowing them to do this with my sacrifices? And so I am going to cut you off. I intended for you and your father's house to serve me forever. Now you will be cut off. And how will you know that this is coming from me? And how will you know this is coming true? On the same day, both of them will die, right? Because they have abused their power and their trust in terms of bringing these sacrifices. And what happens? So Shiloh is overrun, the tabernacle is destroyed, and the sons are killed on the same day, and Eli himself falls down and dies. So tragedy, and they're cut off. So that's the first case we have very early in the book where, because they have abused their office, they are cut off from continuing in service of God. Saul, similarly, he messes up twice. Once by bringing a sacrifice when Shmuel isn't there, and then once again by not listening in terms of what he needs to do with the animals of Amalek, and that everything has to be in cherem, everything has to be essentially destroyed from Amalek. And that's less corruption, right? He's allowed to be king to the end of his days. He just can't pass it on. And David has because he acts also with tremendous corruption when he not only sleeps with Bathsheba, but also arranges for Uriah the Hittite, to be killed in battle, right? In a very underhanded way. Because of that corruption, he is going to be punished from his house, right? Because what he did was messing up essentially someone else's family, and what he did was sins that one does indoors. His punishment comes from his house, and his family breaks apart, right? David also dies a king, right? And he also is able to pass on his kingship. However, by the time he passes on his kingship, he has already lost his two initial crown princes, right? And the third one is going to be lost later on into Shlomo, into Solomon's rule, but that's less David's problem. Admittedly, he's already dead, but he sees his family breaking apart. And if we talk about Shmuel as a book that is tremendously literary, what do I mean by that? I mean that there are characters that develop that have fatal flaws that you can point to and you say, this is what's going on with this person, right? These are the motivations. This is where they're messing up. They've got this characteristic that just doesn't work, right? And you can see, so for Shaul, like, he's not confident enough in himself of what he should do as opposed to what the nation wants him to do. And this messes him up constantly, right? David cares too much about his family. He's too soft on his sons. And it messes him up with Amnon, and it messes him up with Absalom. So you see these kind of, and you have different people of different, Michal. Michal is a princess. And she's in love with David, but she can't adjust to the way he acts with the people, right? There are all sorts of things going on. And you could be like, I can see, it's like reading when you read it over. You're like, hey, I know what the problem is. Oh no, poor Michal. Don't say that to him. Don't say that, no. Oh, Michal, right?
Yeah.
and so these you can absolutely read it this way. And what's interesting is, so for example, Yonatan does not have a fatal flaw. This is something that Uriel Simon points out. Yonatan is perfect. Why can Yonatan be perfect? First of all, because his character doesn't stretch throughout the book, so it's not like, oh, we're just following a perfect character going through the whole book, but also because Yonatan is why Shaul's punishment is so terrible. Shaul has a son who would make a great king. He is everything amazing. He is honorable. He is an amazing commander in battle. He's a tremendous warrior. He is unselfish. He's just amazing. and he will not be king because Shaul sinned and messed up. So Yonatan, his perfect son, will never be king, and in fact dies in battle. So it's a fascinating book. However, what it doesn't give us is it doesn't give us a lot of the geopolitical realities that are in the background, right? So, for example, we don't know why Absalom was able to get such a groundswell of support. Like, we have certain hints, but why was he able, when David supposedly should have been at his full power, what were the issues that allowed Absalom to get a groundswell of support to lead a rebellion against his father? We don't get the whole story. We don't read about what did the Philistines do in the surrounding countryside when they burned down Shiloh, right? What we do have in Shmuel, what is in the background of the book, is how strong the Philistines, the Philistines, are as an enemy. And what's interesting is, of course, they are not as it were, a biblical enemy. If we look at the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, right? You are not going to read about Philistines in the Chumash, right? They're not part of the 7 nations because they are not indigenous to the land. They are the sea peoples. They're coming from outside. They weren't supposed to be here to begin with, right? They are themselves invaders, but they become the force, the military force that Shaul and David have to deal with. Now, of course, they're military force already under the judges, right? For Shimshon, right? They're also the main enemy, and not just for Shimshon, but they're the main force that Shaul and David need to deal with. And the fact that we're dealing with Plishtim also explains certain things. So, for example, why does Shaul tell David, you need to bring me or Lord Plishtim, you need to bring me the foreskins of Philistines. Kill them and bring me their foreskins. Ugh, gross, right? Why? And the answer is because in the entire Near East, men get circumcised. Not necessarily the same age, but men are circumcised in this area of the world. Who isn't circumcised? Philistines aren't circumcised. Don't kill some Canaanite and tell me you killed it. No, I want to see the foreskins. I imagine they're also pretty portable. But this kind of reminds us that we're talking about people coming in from outside but are the main military force in the area. Yafa asked, when was the book of Shmuel written? Good point. The book of Shmuel is clearly written long after the events have occurred. How long after? We don't know. Long enough after that the narrator has to say, in those days, this is what they would call a prophet. So it's long enough after Shmuel is functioning as a prophet to say, oh, this is what they would call a prophet in those days. Long enough after so that it can say, why do people say the phrase, Hagam Shaul b'Nevi'im? Is Saul also among the prophets? Oh, the reason they say that phrase today is because of these stories I'm going to tell you now about what happened to Shaul then. So in other words, we're talking at least a generation right after, I would say, after these events. How much longer than that? It's hard to know. Again, we see in the book of Shmuel that it is actually drawing from different traditions that it is bringing together. Again, for example, with David, right? That we have in David 2 different ways that David becomes known to Shaul, which are 2 completely different ways. He's either brought to play him music to cheer him up, or he first meets him when he's going to fight Goliath. Right? There are 2, and we'll see how they're kind of stitched together, but they're not stitched together very smoothly. It's pretty clear that there's a problem here, right? That Shaul suddenly doesn't know him anymore. What's going on? So the book of Shmuel is looking back on these stories, right? And taking different traditions and different sources about what happened. And of course, as you know, the attitude towards kingship is different. Is a king a good thing? Is a king a bad thing? Right? We see different attitudes. Also, we see some of the repetition is very, very artful. So, for example, we have two stories of why do we say the phrase Hagam Shaul Nevi'im? Why is Saul also among the prophets? We have one story that's in the beginning of Saul's journey, when before he's king, essentially, when he's getting signed that he's going to be king. And at the end of his journey, when he's running after David. In both of them, he ends up joining in ecstatic prophecy. The first time seems to be positive, and the second time, is super negative. And so what we have, and in both cases it says, and that's why people say, Hagam Shaul Nevi'im, is Saul also among the prophets? Where the first time it's like, it's a surprise. Oh, is Saul also among the prophets? Like, I didn't know he was a prophet. And the second time, it's derisive. Oh, is Saul also among the prophets? Is Saul doing that too now? Right? And also kind of a dig at this idea of ecstatic prophecy, where he's going around naked in ecstatic prophecy. Is this a king? What has happened to Saul? Right? What has happened to Shaul? And so on the one hand, looking back and trying to explain this phrase, on the other hand, doing this kind of very artful thing, showing his arc, starting as a hopeful, good, person who he's tall and he's noble and he's modest, and ending with kind of corruption and what does he have left, right? So we have kind of the combination of trying to explain a phrase, like looking back and kind of putting this is the story, and also a kind of a judgment that comes out in the literary parallels, which I think is very kind of indicative of the book of Shmuel as a whole. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of these characters and what happens to them and what that's telling us about the characters themselves, and also certain messages about about kingship. But there's a lot of things. Another thing that's important to know about the book of Shmuel, that unlike other books, in the book of Shmuel, the nation gets punished for things the king does. The king does something and the nation gets punished for it, which frankly does kind of reflect reality and history, where the ruler can screw up and everyone suffers. But in other books, it's, the whole nation sinned and that's why they're suffering now. But in the book of Shmuel, no. Eli and his sons mess up and Shiloh is conquered. Messes up and the nation loses in battle. David messes up, David messes up and there's a famine or a plague. The king has ultimate responsibility to make sure that things are going to go well for the people. The people can mess up, but it's the rulers who have this tremendous responsibility. And in this book, we are very much focused not just on the rulers, but on their interpersonal connections and family relationships. And that actually is what makes the book of Shmuel so great and evocative. And we're going to look even at the story of Hannah, when she has Shmuel and her relationship, it's tremendously, when we look at Hannah's relationship to her husband and Hannah's relationship to Shmuel and her decision, there are things that make this a very personal story. And all of those personal stories are going to keep us through, even though we're talking about rulers. And I think part of that aspect of being personal also shows their limitations. In other words, we're not saying that the king is classically every Egyptian pharaoh was the son of God, right? Somehow was the son of a god, even though he's somehow the son of his father, the pharaoh. He's still kind of the direct son of this god, right? And because he's perfect and he's divine. These kings are not perfect and they're not divine. They are people and they are limited. And that's why they need prophets and they need to listen to the word of God. They are limited people who make the mistakes of limited people. But unlike regular people, when a king makes a mistake, everyone suffers. And that's a theme that we'll also see in the book of Shmuel. And that's what makes these relationships so important and kind of deserving of scrutiny. Any final comments or core questions?
Now, just do we have any idea who actually wrote it down? Or we just know that it's later? We don't have any idea who put it together.
It's like everything. It's like we don't no, not really. And what's interesting, I mean, it's interesting because it doesn't reflect very well on David. Like it's because like, so for example, you could say they have a court chronicle, like chronicle of the court, like kings are like, okay, so you want someone to be like a historian to kind of keep track, even if some kings don't look so good, but with David, with this, like, David really doesn't look good. There are a lot of places where he really doesn't look good. And the question is, but at the same time, he's not the villain. Like, he's the good guy, right? He's like the person that we're kind of rooting for. And so who is writing? So who is writing this, right? But it does absolutely reflect this idea that in the final analysis, you have to listen to God, and the prophet has and both king and prophet have very important roles.
Miriam?
Yes.
Isn't that in itself sort of encapsulate what is utterly unique about Sefer Shmuel? That regardless of how you look at it, the books of Shmuel were written by big fans of David and Bet David, and yet they do not at all shy away from talking about these very unflattering stories.
Tremendously unflattering. I mean, to be perfectly honest, if I were Shlomo HaMelech, if I were King Solomon, I would not want this story about Bathsheba. I would be silencing it. I would be like, no one has to know how my parents met. Right? I mean, you think of it. If I'm an absolute ruler, am I going to let anyone write a book that said that my mother had an affair with my father, and then my father had her husband killed? Right? You remember, like, that's the last thing no way. Right? So it's really unique. The thing with Bathsheba and Uriah, where Uriah is presented as a very honorable. He's like, no, how could I sleep in my bed when my soldiers are out in the wilderness? Because David is trying to paper over his affair by getting this guy to sleep with his wife. And he's like, no, but my men are out in the field. I can't go home to my bed because this Uriah is honorable. And Uriah's been with David from the beginning. He's one of his heroes. He's one of the Gibborim of David. It sets up Uriah as this very honorable man, right? And at the same time, contrasting it with David being super sneaky. And it's presenting this to us, right? And and there's a lot of and David is very human. That's the thing with David. He's very human. When he cries, Avshalom, oh Avshalom, right? He cries, and Yoav ben Tzruya says, buddy, this guy killed people. You can't mourn him this way, right? But to David, it's his son, right? Because he's a human being and not just a king. And that's a big part of David's story, is that through the whole thing, he's a human being and not just a king. Where Shaul, at a certain point, he's a king. And he has flaws, but he's a king, and Michal's a princess, right? David is a person. Anyway.
Interesting to contrast. It's interesting to contrast the way David mourns for Shaul and Yonatan and the way he mourns. So very interesting contrast.
His big thing is Akkadian things and like common law. And his thing was David has to show performatively that he is mourning Shaul and Yonatan. He has to make a performance of it so that people recognize that he didn't have them killed. Now, I wouldn't go that far.
That he didn't have.
I wouldn't go that far, but it is absolutely a performative thing that David does, right? The mourning that he does is a public mourning that everyone must see. Now I think it's also because that's appropriate, because he's recognizing this was the king and the crown prince, right? And he needs to mourn them officially. Mir Malus looks at it in a much more sinister way. Like, he feels that David had to do this performative thing to prove that I was not behind their deaths. As I see someone, what did Moshe say? I always saw Shaul's basic flaw as Dafka, that he couldn't come to truly see himself as the king. I get what you're saying, Moshe, yeah. But I think that it's the problem with someone who doesn't have a lot of self-confidence and who isn't very good with people, is put into a position like that, where he's like, okay, I will now play the part of king, and it's brittle. You know what I mean? Like, and so he's always worried that, no, but the nation doesn't want this. He's not confident enough to say, tough noogies, nation, I'm the king, right? But at the same time, he's very aware of himself as the king, I feel like. So we'll look at it more as we go through the book. So again, thank you everyone for joining me. I will see you next week, and I'm looking forward to it. So see you next week, everyone. Take care. Bye.